I don't want you to be mad at me, but I cheated on you with a Ryzen.
Can we at least talk about this?
That's right, for the month of December, I've been using the Ryzen 5700X over my i7 12700KF. Now to those of you who know me, this may come as a shocking revelation. I've historically not been a fan of AMD. I've owned 3 AMD machines in the past. The first one was an Athlon running Windows XP. That PC fried itself. The second one was an old HP someone gave me years ago. That one was so slow that I barely used it. In fact, it was slower than a Power Mac G3 from the 1990s. It was that bad. The final one was an AMD A10. I dumped that PC because it was incredibly slow. Even worse, it couldn't use more than 12 gigabytes of RAM. Needless to say, I've had a bad history with AMD. However, when Ryzen launched in 2017, I heard so many good things about it. People were even saying that they were faster than Intel's new Skylake CPUs. However, due to my bad history of AMD, I've been hesitant to buy anything on AM4. However, during 2023's Amazon Prime sale, I found the Ryzen 5700X for $170 and a motherboard for $89. I had a free case, power supply, and GPU laying around, so I decided to finally give AMD another chance, and that brings us to today. Has AMD overcome my bias and proven their superiority to Intel, or will I go running back to my i7? Before we start, let us meet the PCs and get to know their specs. Defending its position as my main PC is Combine. Combine has an i7 2700KF, an RTX 3060, and 32GB of DDR4. Challenging Combine is Samurai. Samurai has a Ryzen 7 5700X, an RTX 2070, and 32GB of DDR4. I realize these GPUs are different and not a perfect matchup. However, this should be interesting. The RTX 2070 is faster than the 3060, but the 3060 has 50% more VRAM. While not a perfect matchup, both cards are fairly close, at least according to user benchmark, and hopefully that should not sway things too much. All benchmarks have been tested with games running at their max settings. All settings are identical on both PCs to ensure consistent results. With that, let's jump into the benchmarks. Starting off the benchmark, we have Left 4 Dead. Both PCs ran this game without breaking a sweat, as both easily averaged a frame rate approaching 300. While the Ryzen does edge out the i7 with a better average frame rate of 292 frames a second, the difference falls into margin of error, and to be perfectly honest with these kinds of frame rates, the choice between the two doesn't really matter a whole lot. Ah yes, Fallout 4, a classic. You all know it, I certainly know it, we all love to hate it. But for the purpose of this, we'll put my opinions about this game aside. What's interesting is the frame rate. The vast difference between the two is incredible. In the Intel rig, Fallout 4 scored an average of 60 FPS with a 0.1% low of 35 and a 1% low of 54 frames a second. But on the AMD side, it's a totally different story with an average of 58 FPS and 0.1% and a 1% low of 0. At times the game even froze. Once outside the vault though, things tend to even out, with both PCs scoring an average of 60 FPS, with the i7 slightly scoring a better frame rate, but the difference is so negligible at this point, it's just going to get chalked up to margin of error. The difference for why the frame rates are so drastically different in the vault versus the exterior, I have no idea. Just a bit of disclosure, I made sure to wait to start the benchmark until after I had opened the initial door, after I set my stats, escaped the cryopod, after I opened the first door basically, just to make sure that no loading or any terminal messed with the settings. So I really don't know what happened on the AMD side there, but as you can see, in terms of just playing the game normally though, both PCs are very sufficient. Black Ops 3 Zombies, the map The Giant, saw some extremely competitive results from both sides. Both sides exchanged blows, with the Intel scoring a higher average frame rate, but the Ryzen scoring a more smoother frame rate overall. Still, for a game like this, that's considered within margin of error, as the difference is only between 1 to 4 FPS depending on which benchmark result you're looking at. To be honest, this is a very good showing by both sides. Bethesda's Starfield yielded some incredibly interesting results. While running around New Atlantis, the Ryzen 7 managed to score a much smoother 52 frames a second as opposed to the i7's 42. However, when you look at the 1% lows and the 0.1% lows, you see that the i7 is running at a slower frame rate overall, but it's maintaining a much more stable frame rate than the Ryzen. I would like to preface this by noting that going forward, you won't be seeing the 1% and the 0.1% lows. And the reason for that is because I forgot to clear the AMD's benchmarks before continuing after New Atlantis. As such, that means that it's still factoring the 1% and 0.1% lows from New Atlantis into its calculations. As such, we're only going to really focus on the average frame rate going forward from here. That said, while running around the barren planets of Starfield, the interesting thing is here's where the i7 managed to actually pick up some ground on the AMD, with it scoring an average frame rate of 68 FPS, as opposed to the Ryzen's 59. And in combat, both come within margin of error, with the Intel slightly scoring above the AMD, though with only 3 frames a second. I'm just going to chalk that up to a margin of error. Both performed rather well fighting inside against these spacers. However, when we take the fighting outside, AMD once again clutches the lead of 4 frames a second above the Intel. Once again, I'm just going to put this in the margin of error category. The Intel is having to also deal with fogging and crazy lighting effects, where the AMD is not having to deal with that. And again, too, because the GPUs aren't the same, it could also be a reflection of the graphics cards rather than the actual processors. Still, both these frame rates are more than playable for Starfield. Elden Ring is a game I have not progressed far in, so you have to excuse the fact that I'm benchmarking in a relatively early point in the game. Once again, we see the same story as before, with the Ryzen providing a much better average frame rate than the i7, but the i7 giving a more stable performance than the Ryzen. I'm unsure if the time of day is affecting these frame rates or not, because I've never seen this game at night before. Me testing this on the Ryzen was the first time I've ever known that it could get dark in Elden Ring. So is that it then? Is my i7 PC truly weaker than my Ryzen? While my i7 put up a good fight, and at times was much more stable than the Ryzen, both PCs were being run at the max settings I could crank these games to, and I'm sure if I put time into optimizing it, I could get much better results. Still, with that said, the AMD system got overall higher average frame rates than my i7. Does that mean it's time to ditch Intel and join Team Red? Well, not so fast. There's one last benchmark I gotta show you. And for me, it's the most important one. DAW Studio, my art program. This is where things completely turn around. I'm not going to pretend this one was even close. The i7 PC finished loading and rendering this image in 1 hour 15, while the Ryzen took 1 hour 45. This is huge. While yes, it's only one image, for my comics or scenes with multiple shots, saving half an hour on every single image means I have more free time to work on photoshopping and editing the photo rather than waiting for my PC to finish rendering. Not only that, but if we scroll back to the beginning, you'll see the i7 finish loading everything in 1 minute and 33 seconds, while the Ryzen took 2 minutes and 21 seconds. As you can see, the i7 was already rendering before the AMD had even finished loading everything in. Well, yes, it's only 1 minute. Remember, I could be loading hundreds of these in rapid successions, which means hundreds of minutes saved. At the end of the day, I do more DAWs work than gaming. That alone means, without a question, for my purposes, I'm going to be sticking with Intel. With that all said and done, I have to tip my hat to AMD. I've had bad history with their processors in the past, like I said in the beginning of the video. However, this one proved me wrong. It came in here and it gave the i7 a run for its money. And while sure, it was not able to keep up with things like DAW Studio, it more than beat it in games in a lot of aspects, even though it wasn't always the most stable at times. For $170, this is a rather impressive CPU. AMD may have lost the fight today, but if things keep going the way they are, maybe one day my next PC will potentially be a Ryzen. Who knows? But you know what? Whether these two are working side by side or competing against each other, they're both really good PCs. And for that, the fact they were able to go head to head shows the competition is alive and well in the PC space. And that means better prices and performance for all of us. We're all, at the end of the day, we're all here to play on PC. And you know what? That's something we can all shake on. AMD, I'll be watching your career with great interest. Have a good day, everyone.